Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show, as always, for you on a Friday with Amber in the building. How you doing?
I'm doing well. We've got the navy blue crew
Oh,
today.
yeah. We look like we're matching. Every time I tell Robbie that he and I are matching, he thinks I'm joking on him. But, like, we really are matching.
Yeah.
Like, you guys are trying to make up some weird matching thing.
He's so jealous.
We just have that coordination.
Coming up on Rising, we'll discuss the latest on the congressional shutdown fight and the healthcare funding battle.
Plus, President Trump's administration is telling Congress that it's determined the U.S. is in an armed conflict with drug cartels.
And a judge rejected Kilmar Abrego Garcia's asylum bid to reopen that case, meaning his chances of deportation have risen. But first, Lindsay, what are you seeing through your lens?
We are talking about Project 2025. So, here's the thing about Donald Trump and Project 2025. He told the American people one thing on the campaign trail, and now he's doing the exact opposite in office. Flashback to the 2024 election. Trump was repeatedly asked about Project 2025, a 900-page conservative blueprint written by some of his closest allies. It outlined a sweeping agenda, slashing federal agencies, expanding executive power, banning abortion medication, gutting civil rights enforcement, deporting immigrants on a massive scale, and even politicizing the census. In short, it was a roadmap for remaking American life. But Trump wanted no part of it publicly. On stage in a debate with Kamala Harris, he insisted, quote, "I have nothing to do with Project 2025. I haven't read it. I don't want to read it. Purposely, I'm not going to read it." That was his line. And on June 5th, 2024, he doubled down even harder, writing on Truth Social, quote, "I know nothing about Project 2025. I have no idea who is behind it. I disagree with some of the things they're saying, and some of the things they're saying are absolutely ridiculous and abysmal." Fast forward a little over a year later, and the oxymoron is glaring. Yesterday, that same Truth Social account, Trump bragged, quote, "I have a meeting today with Russ Vought of Project 2025 fame to determine which of the many Democrat agencies, most of which are a political scam, he recommends be cut." That's not just a casual mention. Russ Vought isn't a random advisor. He helped build Project 2025 at the Heritage Foundation. He literally wrote parts of it. And now he's advising Trump in the middle of a government shutdown on which agencies to axe. So let's be clear. Trump went from saying he had no idea who was behind it to handing the pen to the architects. That's not strategy, that's fraud. He lied to the voters on the campaign trail, and he's hoping people won't notice now that he's in power. And what's at stake here isn't just political gamesmanship. If implemented, Project 2025 would disrupt nearly every part of American life: healthcare, education, retirement, security, civil rights, reproductive freedom. Harris put it plainly when she responded to Trump's gloating, quote, "This was always the plan. Project 2025 was always Trump's blueprint to seize unchecked power within the federal government and restrict Americans' freedoms. And he's implementing it right in front of our eyes." So here's my lens. Trump isn't just flirting with Project 2025 anymore, he's marrying it. And the honeymoon phase means slashing agencies, gutting rights, and reshaping government around his will. He told Americans he had, quote, "nothing to do with it," but today, Project 2025 is literally his agenda. And if you're not paying attention, that lie could cost you more than just trust in a politician. It could cost you your freedoms.
All right. Interesting stuff today, Lindsay.
Okay.
Obviously, the shutdown
Shutdown is going to be a bigger conversation. We're going to talk about
Absolutely.
this. Yeah.
Look, I think the tweet, or the Truth Social post rather, where he says of Project 2025 fame is an obvious troll job to really bait Democrats into talking about Project 2025, which is exactly what's happened. And I would point out that he said on the campaign trail, "I like some of the things in it. I don't like some of the other things in it." And we saw precisely that this week with this Russ Vought memo regarding what they're going to do during the shutdown. That was something that Trump apparently liked. But then on the abortion medication, we actually saw the FDA in the aftermath of what they promised was going to be a review of the safety of mifepristone, actually approved a new generic version of that drug for public consumption. So that was apparently something that Trump didn't like in Project 2025. So it seems to me perfectly consistent with what he said on the campaign trail.
Well, I think saying I haven't read it, he doesn't know the architects. He knew them well. I mean, some of them have positions in the administration. And I think when you talk about the idea that overall, what people were most alarmed about Project 2025 was the consolidation of a lot of the power to the president. And we've seen that multiple times in the last 9 months. He's tried to skip over Congress or made something an executive order or, move forward in ways that, to me, based on American history, are not the most presidential of strategies. That's why we have 3 branches of government. I think that people should be alarmed with the amount that he insisted. He hadn't even read the thing or known the architects, but he knew them very well. And so it's just like nobody wants a liar to be their president. And that is just a lie. It doesn't matter if you liked a little bit of it, you liked a lot of it. How do you know about it if you haven't read it? What parts do you not like? That's all I'm saying, like the integrity of it all. To blatantly pretend when every journalist pretty much understood what was there. All the Democrats understood what was there. And I agree with Robbie. Everyone made it like this boogeyman. Oh my God, it's really conservative policy that's explained in way too many pages. But then there's so much more in there that's overextending in ways that traditional conservatives maybe didn't. And so I think that it just needs to be acknowledged that that was on your agenda when you're campaigning, so people would know what they're getting, because you're kind of distancing yourself from it, but you haven't read it, but now we know you read it, and these are some of your friends, and so it's like, what's the plan here?
Based on people that I spoke to close to the campaign and on the campaign during the election, his frustration actually with the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025 was real, and it was not something that he was interested in becoming his platform. Obviously, there's going to be things that he agrees with because, as you mentioned, a lot of it is sort of standard bearer conservative policy. But at the time, I think it was actually sincere that he did not want this to be his campaign promises because it wasn't entirely consistent with what he was running on. Abortion, again, is a perfect example of that. He is much more moderate on abortion than anything in Project 2025. And there was actually, he was toying with the idea of not hiring anyone for his admin from the Heritage Foundation because he was frustrated with them for trying to make it out like this was Trump's plan when he had no hand in creating it. So naturally, the conservative movement in DC is fairly small. People who wrote forwards for books or wrote policy portions of Project 2025 were sort of inevitably going to end up in the administration. But I can tell you that I think it, not permanently, but did a lot of long-term damage to Trump's relationship with the Heritage Foundation. And we saw him have a much closer relationship with America First Policy Institute because of it.
So I want to go back to something that you said earlier. You mentioned that President Trump might be doing this to try to egg on Democrats to join the conversation.
That's exactly what he's doing.
Right. So I hadn't even thought about that. So that's a great point to bring up. And if they're falling into that, so what are the next steps? Because I know this was like such a boogeyman that if the American public, the same people you're trying to save healthcare for, according to Democrats, are seeing that Project 2025 boogeyman is coming back in full effect with the architect now making decisions, which one is scarier, losing healthcare or losing all your freedoms, according to what people were saying about Project 2025? What is the next step? So now you brought it back up and you made everybody alarmed and aware of it. And now they're going to just drop the whole healthcare argument because of the fact that you're bringing in the Project 2025 architect?
Well, for the first time in any modern political history, really, Republicans are on offense in this shutdown. Chuck Schumer did not shut down the government because he cared about healthcare. He shut down the government because he's facing a primary challenge from AOC. And he's nervous that Democrats are turning on him. And so he felt like he had to, quote unquote, do something. And Democrats walked right into a trap because not only were Republicans prepared to lay off thousands of federal workers, shut down some of these agencies under Project 2025, but the Democrats also apparently didn't realize that when they were calling for going back to the pre-CR spending before the spring deal that they made, that included healthcare for illegal aliens and funding for transgender surgery. So when they said, well, we're focusing on healthcare, they did that because pollsters told them that that was a popular issue. They didn't think about the fact that they had also taken healthcare positions that were wildly unpopular with the American people.
Yeah, I think what we're going to see happen is this kind, and we're talking about this in the next segment, so I don't want to go too far into it, but I think what we're going to see happen is Chuck Schumer really is, and I would agree with you there, he has a position to defend, and he knows that the Democrats are in a position where after losing the election in both Congress houses, you're kind of like, what is the party standing for? And if you know healthcare is a winning issue, maybe to resurface that energy around Obamacare for Democrats and get people excited about something again is better than nothing. As the government shutdown drags on, healthcare is at the heart of the debate, with both sides saying a lot. We'll be right back.
It's a lie told by the Democrats that they're not trying to give healthcare benefits to illegal aliens. It's a lie that is obviously untrue if you just look at the text that they gave us. And all you have to do is understand that this is about who benefits. We think the American people's government ought to benefit American citizens. The Democrats are willing to shut it down to benefit illegal aliens. The contrast couldn't be more clear.
Day 3 of the government shutdown, and what is the big issue preventing it from reopening? Well, it's health care, specifically for immigrants who are in the country illegally.
Now you heard Vice President Vance there expressing what many Republicans have since Wednesday morning, that the Democrats want to extend benefits to undocumented immigrants, an idea that Democrats have pushed back hard on. Take a listen to Senator Elizabeth Warren on CBS Mornings Thursday.
Republicans say what you're really fighting for is taxpayer dollars for, as they put it, illegal aliens. I know that's not strictly true, but there is a provision.
Excuse me, not strictly true.
It's not true directly, but
out lie.
Senator Warren continued, insisting that the money Democrats are fighting for will go to hospitals and not undocumented immigrants.
The difference is whether or not hospitals, who under laws that date back to Ronald Reagan, may provide emergency care to anyone who's unconscious, will actually get reimbursed at a very low level that will put the hospital ultimately out of business potentially, or at a higher level. The Republicans, there is no change in the number of undocumented immigrants who get any help under what the Democrats want.
But it's not just emergency room funds that are at the heart of this debate. Vice President Vance also pointed out a second part of the Democrats' proposed plan that he says gave certain immigrants a special status to collect health care benefits.
The Biden administration gave mass parole to millions upon millions of illegal aliens, and then they simultaneously made those parolees eligible for health care benefits funded by taxpayers. In the One Big Beautiful Bill, President Trump and congressional Republicans turned off that money to health care funding for illegal aliens. The Democrats want to turn it back on. And in their initial proposal, the first thing that they put out to reopen the government, they actually turned that money for health care benefits for illegal aliens back.
And even some Democrats are admitting that at least some money would go to health care for illegal immigrants. Here's Rokana saying exactly that.
The amount of money that actually is going towards people who are undocumented is such a small portion of the Medicaid cuts or the Affordable Care Act, if at all. And so we can argue that point, but the reality that even the vice president would acknowledge, that anyone who looks at the numbers will acknowledge, is 90 to 95% of the funding we're talking about is talking about funding for American citizens.
Now, as the debate continues, there's still no deal in sight. Members of Congress tell The Hill they expect the shutdown to drag on until at least the middle of next week. Some expect even longer. I mean, I think shutting down the government, I've been saying this over and again since the first time we talked about this year, is a failure of Congress to do its job. So I think where a lot of Democrats and Republicans agree is that this is not ideal. I think this has been labeled one of the most ineffective Congress in years, in history, even. And so to me, it's just frustrating to watch this all play out. I know it happens on both sides. You can look at the last decade and see who was responsible for which shutdown. But for me, I think Republicans are just misleading and not being honest. And I really wanted to articulate what the law actually does and what is actually being discussed. So I think there's already U.S. law on the books that prohibits migrants from getting federal subsidized health care. That's understood, right? Through Medicaid, Affordable Care Act, Children's Health Insurance Program, there's a 1996 statute that established that. So the Democratic bill doesn't change that existing law. This dispute, it really revolves around these words called lawfully present, and depending on how they're interpreted. So there are estimated 1.4 million people that are considered, quote, lawfully present within the United States, including DACA people, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival, and people with TPS, which is Temporary Protected Status. And so those beneficiaries who are still going through the legal process may be some people that actually are affected here, but we're not talking about random people who just jumped over the border. And they're not technically undocumented or illegal immigrants. The government knows exactly who they are. You know, many are going through the process of seeking that legal documentation. And among other things, you know, they're not unlawful border crossers. So I think that when we're conflating every single thing around immigrants, it's frustrating because we're having conversations about people who are here by laws that we put in place, like temporary protected status or DACA, and we're saying, okay, well, now we want to make sure that none of these people are getting care. Or like Elizabeth Warren brought up, if emergency room visits, like what are we going to do if somebody goes to the ER? They're going to get help because they're wheeled in. It's not happening at a going rampant rate of migrants in the ER. But if they are, what's the plan here? We have to come up with a plan because they are here. And sometimes even though people wanted immigration reform, the president's goal with getting every single person out is extremely lofty. And if somebody goes to the hospital, what's our plan?
Yeah, so you're correct on that point that does exist, that program that you're talking about for reimbursement for medical care. But in addition, there's also this reimbursement for the emergency room services, which does go to illegal immigrants. And also if
to the hospitals, right?
Right, for care for illegal immigrants, and I'm going to talk about that because there's a lot of fraud wrapped up in that issue. And then in addition to that, there are some state programs, which are not federal, so it's not against the statute that you're talking about, that do provide additional Medicaid funds for illegal aliens outside of emergency room care, and they get federal reimbursements for the money that they spend on those individuals. So one of the contentions from Republicans was, we don't want to indirectly subsidize states' Medicaid programs for giving care to illegal aliens. They should have to bear the brunt of that cost because it's their policies, which are against our policies, that allowed illegal aliens to come in and place that burden on the healthcare system. But I want to get into this point about emergency rooms because Chris Pope from the Manhattan Institute put out an interesting tweet thread about this issue, which showed that it's not really just people who are unconscious going to the emergency room and getting care, that these hospitals are being used as primary care providers for illegal aliens because they know that they're not going to have to pay for the services. He pointed out that Medicaid spending on emergency services for undocumented aliens soared last year. 71% of the spending is in California, where spending on emergency services for illegal aliens jumped from $1.6 billion in 2023 to $6.4 billion in 2024. They established a state benefit for undocumented immigrants, supposedly with state money. They have classified 56% of its increased spending on unauthorized immigrants as emergency care. Well, normally emergency care only accounts for 5% of healthcare spending. So this is a classic case of Democrats saying, well, it's only when people are going to the hospital because they're going to die otherwise, when really what they're doing is they want the federal government to reimburse the hospitals, and they're going to give all of their primary care, all medicine to illegal aliens through the hospitals so that they don't have to pay for it themselves.
So while I don't think attaching this issue is necessarily the right thing to do right now for Democrats, I do think that Republicans are going to have to come to the table and talk about this. And I don't know why Democrats who are not in power or a powerful position would wait till the next opportunity towards the end of the year when we pretty much know how this game goes. And I know that Republicans have to be concerned because there are News Nation reporters that are reporting on Congress on the ground saying probably there are some conversations happening between, not a lot, but some Republicans about how to come to the table on this in this shutdown. So it's not like Democrats are just catching the L here only. I think people have to be considerate that there are people like Senator Josh Hawley, who was very vocal about how cuts to Medicare and Medicaid will affect his constituents. And I think that he's not the only person that feels that from the big, beautiful bill. And so going again and saying healthcare, we can deal with it later, no matter putting the migrants aside, there's still people who are concerned about their health care. And so this conversation does need to happen really soon. And I think that Democrats are pretty confident that Republicans are probably not going to engage them before these subsidies from the Affordable Care Act run out at the end of this year.
Well, I know we're going to continue talking about this issue, but up next, a judge has struck down Kilmar Abrego Garcia's bid for asylum. We'll discuss what it means for his deportation. An immigration judge denied Kilmar Abrego Garcia's bid to reopen his 2019 asylum case on Wednesday, giving Garcia 30 days to appeal the decision.
Now, immigration agents had arrested Abrego Garcia in 2019 since he was undocumented, and he was denied asylum since he had been in the country for more than a year at that point. Abrego Garcia's team asked to reopen the case after the DHS said he may be deported to Uganda. But Regional Deputy Chief Immigration Judge Philip Taylor said the request was untimely.
Judge Taylor also said there was insufficient evidence that DHS had decided to remove Abrego Garcia to Uganda or another third country. He continued, quote, "The word may is permissive and indicates to the court that in sending this notification to Respondent's Counsel, the department sought to convey that it reserved the right to remove him to Uganda, not necessarily that it intended to do so, that it had decided to do so, or that it would do so imminently."
Now, Abrego Garcia's team pointed to the fact that since he had been deported to El Salvador and brought back to face human trafficking charges, he could be eligible for asylum. The judge ultimately denied the motion. Now, Abrego Garcia's lawyers have also argued he can't receive a fair trial due to, quote, highly prejudicial, inflammatory, and false statements said about him.
The DHS celebrated the ruling, writing in part on X. His lawyers tried to fight his removal from the U.S., but one thing is certain. This Salvadorian man is not going to be able to remain in our country. He will never be allowed to prey on innocent Americans again. I can't believe we're still talking about this guy.
Yeah, I think, Democrats made the wrong choice by trying to make this a flagship argument.
Absolutely.
To me, it wasn't that serious. But I also know that now that we're here, a lot of Trump officials labeled him as an MS-13 gang member. We're using evidence that wasn't concrete. And so to me, when we want to go into stuff like that in the media and start to paint a picture, this is not even about whether or not we want to deport a migrant that may or may not be committing a crime. It's really now about how the U.S. handles asylum law, deportation mistakes, and political pressure now that we have a federal stage and a world stage, or American stage at least, that people are watching this on. And so I think a little bit has become like blown out of proportion. You said it. I can't believe we're still talking about this right now. It's like we're really hyper-focused on this, and all I think that Democrats should have been asking for is that this man just gets his day in court and we figure out how to handle this the same way that we handle everybody, and not use him as like a political football to prove a point, and just make sure that, look, if he's in a gang, then okay, he's in a gang. Deport him, go to jail, whatever the process is, but do not try to make a point out of immigration because it's a winning issue. It's the same thing that you were just saying about healthcare. Don't just try to make some random point to prove something to your constituents. Be honest about it, and let's solve this in the way that the American Constitution tells us to.
I think Democrats really got punked by Abrego Garcia's lawyer, because how this whole process unfolded was that when Abrego Garcia's lawyer filed his petition to prevent removal from DHS, or rather said that he was mistakenly deported to El Salvador, which was true. He wasn't supposed to be deported there. Now he might go to Uganda, which they would legally be allowed to do. The lawyer did not include a large portion of his recorded immigration history and the evidence that the government had against him, stating that he was credibly believed to be a member of MS-13, that he had engaged in domestic violence, and that he had engaged in human trafficking. So the reason why the information then came out about the MS-13 gang affiliation was not through the media, but it was actually from the court filings in response to that challenge from the DOJ. So if Abrego Garcia's lawyer had actually given his full history in front of the court, then the DOJ would have never had to introduce those documents into the docket in response to that filing.
Yeah, and again, these are not small charges like human trafficking. Like you're right. When you look at this, you're wondering why would Democrats even care to make this like some flagship issue of the beginning of this year. But I think that at the end of the day, now that we're here and that it's been so highly publicized, we understand because of the Supreme Court ruling that he can't just be sent to any country, right? So now Uganda's on the table, but we have to make sure that we're following procedures that are set up in our country, particularly for cases like this.
Yeah, I think he's got his fair share of due process at this point.
Next up, the Trump administration has told Congress they have decided the U.S. is in an armed conflict with drug cartels. Stick around. President Trump says the United States is now in a, quote, armed conflict with drug cartels and is declaring them to be unlawful combatants. This comes after the U.S. conducted several deadly strikes on boats allegedly trafficking drugs.
The memo, which was sent to the National Security Congressional Committees and obtained by The Hill, says, quote, the president directed the Department of War to conduct operations against them pursuant to the law of armed conflict. The United States has now reached a critical point where we must use force in self-defense and defense of others against the ongoing attacks by these designated terrorist organizations. Trump addressed U.S. military leaders in Quantico, Virginia earlier this week. Here's some of what he had to say about cartels.
We have to put the traffickers and cartels on notice, and we've done that. And we've put them, a lot of them, we've called them a terrorist organization, which is actually a big thing to do. Nobody's done it, but I've done it with a lot of them. It gives you a tremendous advantage. If you try to poison our people, we will blow you out of existence, because that's the only language they really understand. That's why you don't see any more boats on the ocean. You don't see any boats. Around Venezuela, there's nothing.
But questions are being raised about the legality of this move by the Trump administration. Members of Congress have said that Trump does not have the authority to use the military to target the cartels. Rhode Island Senator and member of the Armed Services Committee, Jack Reed, says, quote, every American should be alarmed that President Trump has decided he can wage secret wars against anyone he labels an enemy. drug cartels must be stopped, but declaring war and ordering lethal military force without Congress or public knowledge nor legal justification is unacceptable.
All right, Lindsay, what do you think about this? I'll let you go first.
So I think my biggest issue, of course, we need to combat all the drugs coming in this country and also make it a point to do so. But I think those are usually called counter narcotics missions. And we saw when Trump had made a decision in the past, he said he's labeling this as terrorism. And so now these are called counterterrorism missions. And I think what's missing from this is that with drug cartels, they're criminal organizations and have been labeled that through past presidents for decades. And, they're not like political or ideological actors like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. And so I think that when we're trying to conflate everything just to justify military action, that's when we're abusing power. Now, while they should be combated and while we should certainly have these counter-narcotics missions continue, I don't think we should relabel them in order to give Trump the authority to make decisions that generally Congress would make.
So I think one of the big reasons, or two big reasons, why they were rightfully classified as terrorist organizations is that, one, especially in Venezuela, the cartels pay off the government so that they are able to operate freely. And they also routinely commit executions, including of political figures and people who oppose them, in order to create terror so that people do not oppose their ability to run drugs, smuggle humans, etc. So the way that they operate in terms of silencing dissent, paying people off through bribes, to me is very much politically motivated because they want the government in their pocket. And they also execute these types of terror campaigns around the border as well, forcing people to pay for safe passage, forcing people to smuggle drugs or humans if they want the ability to cross into the United States. Now, in terms of the strikes happening in mostly the Caribbean, to me, I view it sort of like combating pirates, right? It's an extrajudicial group. It's technically not a country, although they seemingly have the government in their pocket. But it would be, to me, the same as the Coast Guard going after a Somali pirate. I think that's the closest analogy that we could give to what the cartels are doing when they're running drugs up through the ocean. So I personally don't have any problem with the way that Trump has been approaching this, and I think it's high time that we take it seriously. Obviously, with the massive amount of increase in drug trafficking into the United States on the supply side over the past 10 years, whatever we were doing in terms of these counter-narcotic missions was not enough.
Well, I think the biggest concern for most critics is that we're expanding presidential war powers. And so we can still get things accomplished by, like you said, maybe it wasn't working, but now we have a Republican-led Congress in both the House and the Senate. So then get it done. Talk to your constituents and tell them and see what the American people want to do. Because also, this is supposed to be the America First president. And from what we've understood, from attacking boats in the Caribbean to going to war with Iran that people were dissatisfied with for 12 days, and engaging in conflict, to some declaring the department as not the Department of Defense, but now the Department of War, and now expanding your executive privilege by relabeling something from narcotics to terrorism. These are all four examples of it seemingly going in the wrong direction. We want more conversation around how to bring America at the forefront and not to be engaged in foreign conflicts. And so that should be a conversation amongst the people that represent Americans in Congress to figure out how the best way to proceed is, especially since the drugs you're talking about are infiltrating communities around the country. And so we don't just want decisions being made willy-nilly by our president, but rather decisions being made by Congress as they're supposed to be.
Yeah, I think it's pretty obviously America first to say that we should have some kind of action against boats that are coming up to America to poison our people with drugs. And I would challenge any Democrat who opposes this.
Well, I think we could try the people, right? We could arrest the people. We just killed them. That, to me, it could constitute, depending on how you label it, as way too aggressive of an action, depending on the proof and information that we have. And then if there were any civilians on that boat, now we're going too far. So that's what I mean. We have Congress to help decide and make firm decisions like this when we're talking about narcotics missions. And I think that that's where we risk extending presidential power too far, because we have to make sure that we're counteracting actual drugs coming into our country and not just President Trump thinks that might be a boat with narcotics on it. And, and say that one person was a civilian, then what? now we're engaging another country by killing their civilians.
Well, I mean, obviously, we're not going to be able to see whatever intel they have that has led them to believe that this boat is filled with cartel members smuggling drugs. We're not going to be able to see confidential sources and methods that led to that assessment, just as we wouldn't in really any decision to take military action. And I do find it interesting, you know, when in his first term, Trump executed the strike on Qasem Soleimani, there was no hand-wringing about, well, Congress didn't know about this and Congress didn't approve this. Everyone actually celebrated. But now when we go after cartel boats that are bringing thousands of pounds of fentanyl or cocaine to the United States, it's like, oh, well, his presidential power has gone too far.
Well, I think it's a series of events that I mentioned. I think the relabeling, to use it, he's calling everyone involved with this terrorist. And
they
just
are.
use, but and mind you, that you could feel that way, but terrorists are actually usually associated with this ideological thing that's like ISIS or Al Qaeda and how they're operating. And I know you're saying
Well,
that
not
they're
necessarily. I mean, so terrorism can have ideological motivations, but really, I think the primary definition is that they use violence in order to affect political ends. And in this case, the cartels absolutely do that because, again, they are deliberately executing people, paying off governments so that they have the political ability, right, the approval of politicians in order to behave in a certain way.
Yeah, and this is the thing. I'm not saying let's not counter drugs coming into this country. I'm just saying with Soleimani, we're talking about a totally different instance versus right now, we're talking about something that for decades has been labeled as narcotics and has been handled in that way as drug criminals, drug rings, and we handle those specifically in a certain way. And even though that way is not adequate because we haven't captured and stopped enough drugs coming in this country, perhaps that's when you come together with the leaders of this country, not just President Trump, because we don't live in a dictatorship, to talk about what the strategy forward is. And if we really would like to label these people as terrorists, have a conversation with the highest people in the land, you know, and not just President Trump, which is what makes us different in America, a democracy, that President Trump shouldn't just decide things, especially on the heels of calling something the Department of War, but telling us you don't want to engage in many wars on the heels of attacking Iran and saying you don't want to engage in international conflict. It's just confusing to the average American that's watching all this play out within weeks of one another and feeling unsettled. And that's something that should be addressed because, again, we're not a dictatorship. He has to answer to the people that got him in office.
I would challenge any Democrat who thinks this is a bad idea to talk to a mother in Ohio who lost her son to a drug overdose and see what her reaction is, because my guess is this will be broadly popular with the American people. Coming up, the Trump administration has made an offer to universities when it comes to funding. Some Democrats are not happy about it. Stay with us.
The White House has reportedly sent a memo to 9 major universities offering them financial incentives to comply with the administration's demands.
The memo is titled The Compact for Academic Excellence in Higher Education. The Hill reports that, quote, among the demands are reforms to the way race or ethnicity are used in admission and hiring practices, institutional neutrality, student grading, and demanding that transgender men be excluded from women's locker rooms and sports teams. The White House says schools that don't sign the compact will still be eligible for grants, but will not get priority. The Trump administration has made education reform one of its top priorities. Earlier this year, the administration demanded that universities eliminate their DEI practices or risk losing federal funding.
Now, Democratic politicians are once again asking universities to fight back and ignore the memo. Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen writes on X, quote, first Trump blackmailed universities into suppressing free speech. Now he's bribing them with taxpayer dollars to enforce his agenda. Corruption and authoritarianism, plain and simple. No university should cave to this blatantly unconstitutional coercion. And California Governor Gavin Newsom took a more direct approach, saying, quote, California universities that bend to the will of Donald Trump and sign this insane compact will lose billions in state funding immediately. California will not bankroll schools that sign any academic freedom away.
The University of Southern California is one of the 9 universities that was asked to sign the compact. Others include the University of Virginia and Ivy League schools Dartmouth and Brown.
Okay, I have so many questions about this. Like, first of all, there are 4,000 or between 4,000 to 6,000. I couldn't get an exact number based on colleges, universities, how they're labeled, but in the country there are thousands, and you pick 9. So what makes these 9 like elite schools, the top of your list, that could be negotiated with your maybe looking at favoritism and putting a political test just to certain universities? And then also the question is, why was Harvard left out, right? So if you are used to the hammer approach and continuing to sell schools that you already have disagreement as the Trump administration, do this, or pay $200 million, $50 million, whatever it is, why are you doing the olive branch approach now and not extending that also to Harvard when you're in conversation with Harvard? That would be a great way forward if this is now understanding that perhaps the policies that you put forth towards Columbia, other schools like that, Harvard as well, maybe were too strict, too uncomfortable, too causing too much tension. And so now you're doing the olive branch method in advance and seeing if that works to avoid suing and putting funds towards your presidential library.
Right. Well, so, I mean, I don't know why Trump would capitulate to Harvard at this point when they're close to a $500 million settlement.
Well, he capitulated to Columbia. He said, add them to this 9-school list. So it's like, well,
they already reached
paid
their settlement.
Yeah, but it's like they still had the beef. I mean, same exact thing. If Harvard pays or not, why not extend the olive branch and try to create a new relationship, a way forward?
Yeah, I don't know if I would describe this as olive branch, though. It's sort of an implicit threat, isn't it? Like, if you don't sign on to this, then you're going to lose priority for grant funding. And I think it's a great thing because all of the items that are listed in this compact should be common sense. I mean, the idea of not using affirmative action, for example, in admissions and hiring, well, that was struck down by the Supreme Court, right? So if a school is still engaging in that, then they're violating federal law. So they really shouldn't get federal funding anyway. Same thing with the allowing men to compete in women's sports or use their bathrooms, locker rooms, etc. That was laid out in an executive order to not be the position of the federal government, and also warn that schools that receive, again, public federal funding, if they engaged in those practices, would risk losing it. So it's all pretty common sense measures, and it's not abnormal or unusual for an administration to waive the threat of pulling federal funding from schools that don't abide by their policies. For example, during the Biden administration, he wanted to rewrite Title IX to include gender identity as a protected category in addition to biological sex. And of course, whenever you have a university that's not complying with Title IX, the punishment would be that they don't get federal funding anymore. So by Biden doing that, he was basically forcing all of these schools, well, you have to accept gender identity as a protected class under Title IX, or you don't get federal funding. So something unprecedented about this to require that schools abide by certain standards in order to get those funding goals met.
I mean, there's also a limitation in there on international student acceptance, and some of the best and brightest international students intermingle with American students that cause the diversity of thought and worldly thinking to thrive at places like colleges and universities. So that's disturbing. But also, like you mentioned, if Biden did it, Trump did it, I would hate to continue to see this go back and forth and see colleges and universities bending the knee or capitulating to any or all people in power every time, when the exact reason for college is to grow and nurture thoughts and develop who you are. And so it's so restrictive that it's becoming this back and forth ping pong about who's in power that'll just change when the next president becomes in power. And it also is kind of interrupting the whole free speech of it all, the whole free experience of college, by having a president now threatening 9 schools. So the rest of the 4,000 to 6,000 are just kind of could do what they want until he gets to each one. Like, how do we keep the standard pretty consistent throughout schools? Like you said, if the Supreme Court makes a rule about something, yes, colleges should abide by it in order to receive federal funding. But now you're having a state and federal funding war because, like you just saw Newsom say, okay, well, I'll pull state funding if you capitulate to President Trump. And so colleges and universities have the great responsibility to govern themselves in ways that help students learn and grow in their experience. Now they have to worry about being extremely politicized and go back and forth about what the administration wants them to do. And now, not only that, worry about losing funding from state governments because maybe they brought in one too many international students for Trump's liking. And there's little things in there. I'm like, okay, this is just so, one, a waste of time, but 2, also not allowing colleges and universities to operate in the free way that they should in order to create a learning space that nurtures wide-ranging ideas, diverse students, international students, people with different perspectives, some people who believe and experience the transgender experience not to be ostracized. Whether you agree with it or not, they still should not be ostracized.
Well, I can go to school there. They just can't come in my bathroom or play on my sports team. Well, and ostracization.
I think that's my point, is that we should not be making colleges in the middle of our political back and forth that Congress can't even seem to sort out.
Well, elections have consequences, and so colleges have a choice to make. You can abide by these really simple common sense rules in order to get federal funding, or you can say, we're going to do what we want and we won't accept your federal funding. You only get to say that colleges can do whatever they want if they're not receiving taxpayer dollars, right? Taxpayer dollars always come with strings attached. That's how it works. So they could go the route of Hillsdale, for example, in Michigan, and say that we're not going to accept a single dollar from the federal government. We're going to do this our own way. And that way we are free to make the decisions that we want to make. But colleges want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to get these sweet grants coming in from the taxpayer, from the federal government, but they don't want to abide by really basic things like academic freedom or integrity. They don't want to abide by Supreme Court rulings on affirmative action. They don't want to abide by federal executive orders on biological sex in Title IX. So great, then don't take the money, right?
So, but
take the money.
What does USC do then? Now they're in a precarious situation. Let's say they did want what I look at as an olive branch, and they want to accept this compact from President Trump, and they're like, fine, whatever, let's take it. And then Newsom's like, well, all state funding goes away. Then they're in, like, what are we doing? That's like a balancing act if they would like funding for their school. So just lose the state funding in order to work with, because like you said, you have to work with the government, local and federal, if you want to receive their dollars. And if local and federal are at a friction point to the fact that they're mocking one another, sending memes to one another and acting like children, and you're a college actually trying to govern itself in the middle of that back and forth, that's extremely childish.
Well,
I mean, come on, that's what's happening at USC.
Well, I'll tell you what, Governor Newsom is going to regret doing that. If USC signs this compact and he pulls state funding for a university for daring to sign on to priorities that, again, are very common sense, that most of the American public agrees with. I mean, if he says, I'm going to take billions of dollars in state funding from this college, or millions of dollars, however much it is, because they say that a man can't play on the girls' sports team, that's going to be a
And because they say we have to put a cap on
2028.
international students based on what Trump thinks is appropriate. You know, there's like more in there is what I'm saying. So you have to agree to everything. Trump didn't say you can nitpick through this compact. He said, sign on.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're out of time because I would like to argue about the international students clause, because I do think there's valid reasons for bringing that. One of which, just really quickly, is that often colleges will crowd out American students by using international students, admitting them not just because they're the best and brightest, but because most importantly, they have the ability to pay full sticker price for tuition.
We'll be talking about this much more.
A new poll shows Americans are more pessimistic than ever about politics, but there's still some room to be optimistic. We'll break down the numbers right after this.
A new Times Siena poll shows voters aren't sure if America's political divisions can be overcome. Let's take a look. The September survey asked just over 1,300 voters what they think of America's political system. 64% said they believe the country is too politically divided to solve its problems. Only a third said they believe the country can still address its problems. Compare that to just 5 years ago in September of 2020, most still thought problems could be addressed. Keep in mind this was during the height of the pandemic and the summer of Black Lives Matter protests following the death of George Floyd. 51% said yes, problems could still be addressed, while just 42% said no.
So what's the reason behind the stark rise in pessimism? Well, it may have something to do with voters' top issues. You may remember during last year's election season, the economy and immigration were consistently listed as the top issues for voters. And while the economy is still the top issue, the level of polarization and division in the country has taken the number 2 spot, double what it was 2 years ago.
The good news is that polarization may feel worse than it actually is. When Democrats and left-leaning independents were asked if they viewed Republicans as the enemy or simply fellow Americans with whom they disagree, an overwhelming majority, 84%, said they see Republicans as fellow Americans. Only 10% said the enemy.
It's a similar story on the right. When asked the same question of Democrats, 82% of Republicans and Republican-leaning independents said they view Democrats as fellow Americans. 14% of Republicans identify Democrats as the enemy.
Well, President Trump is probably one of those Republicans, since he said at Charlie Kirk's funeral, I hate my enemies. I'm assuming he was talking about most Democrats that he argues with all the time. But I guess that's up for interpretation.
Probably tried to put him in jail.
Probably, so maybe they're irreconcilable. Every time I see polls like this, I get concerned because I know that social media exaggerates what you think the whole world is feeling. and to bring it back to the U.S., what you think America's feeling. And sometimes, there are millions of people who are not active on social media, don't share their thoughts or ideas on social media, and kind of sometimes social media can show the worst of us. And so you think, oh my God, we're so divided, we can have nothing in common. I don't think right now is the worst of times. I mean, the country has been through civil war. Country has been through the Great Depression, right? The country has been through slavery. Like, this is not the worst of times. And when I sit here and have dialogue with like yourself and Robbie, I think that is a beautiful thing, because for me, part of having conversation and what people need to see more of is the fact that you can disagree. You can disagree vehemently. You can even argue, but you have to level it in respect for one another. You have to level the conversation in actually trying to get somewhere. And even when you're wrong, think about that, learn something from someone else, have dialogue. I don't think that we should be in a state, because I felt like during the pandemic, actually, that was the worst time. Like, I would go to Thanksgiving and one person would have a different perspective and tensions were so high. We just said, I remember the conversation, do not talk politics at Thanksgiving. Like, it was a point, I think 2020 pandemic, already tensions were high. We couldn't even see each other. But once we really got out of the pandemic, it was like, we just got a chance to breathe. There are a lot of different conversations that we were avoiding. But I think now, and even then, having a grandmother who passed away 2 years ago at 106, she's lived through some pretty bad times. And she and I had direct conversation because she was lucky enough to have her cognitive abilities until she passed. And I know that we all can have more conversations and do better. And this is certainly not the worst it's going to be.
Yeah. And I think to underscore that point, that's why the assassination of Charlie Kirk hit so hard for so many, because he was living that out in his daily life, right? Having conversations with the other side. And obviously people have raised issues they disagreed with him on, or they didn't like his tone in some circumstances, but he was trying to bridge that gap. Yes, he was trying to convince people to adopt conservative values, but he was actively listening to people who had very different opinions than him. And ultimately he was killed for it. And it's like, well, what does that mean for the future of dialogue in this country if someone who very much was a free speech, open dialogue champion loses their life for trying to exercise that freedom and that ability? And that's one of the things that lingers for me as is very deeply concerning for the future of our country.
So do you feel like you agree with the poll that we're pretty much at a point of no return between?
I don't know that we're at no return, but I do feel that the division is very palpable. And I was listening to the interview between Ezra Klein and Ta-Nehisi Coates the other day. Mm-hmm. And when they were talking about this divide, they basically said that they viewed Republicans as having gone so far over the line. And I thought it really lacked self-awareness to not acknowledge, I think, how far left they've shifted the Overton window at the same time, and is one of the reasons why we're having this issue. Yeah,
we'll keep talking about this a lot more. That does it for us on Rising Live. Look out for more exclusive content on our YouTube coming your way today. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel so you don't miss any content. And listen to us wherever you listen to your podcast while on the go. We're available. We'll see you next week.